Kia ora koutou. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this Global Women Impact Series webinar. My name is Audette and we're beaming in to you from all across Australia and New Zealand. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining this meeting from the lands of the Yuin people, and two of my panelists, Anna and Ilana, are joining us from the Eora Nation. We're here to talk about very important business, leadership in times of crisis, and we're doing this in the footsteps of elders who've walked the land of these beautiful countries that were on before us. I often wonder what they must be thinking as they look at what's happening in our complex world right now. Their wisdom should infuse our thinking on how we lead in this complex future. I'd like to ask our Kiwi panelist, our wonderful Kiwi panelist, Guy Ryan, to greet us from Aotearoa and Te Reo. Guy.
Ti hei Māori ora, manawatia te Māori o rangi, manawatia te Māori o papa, manawatia te Māori tū, manawatia te Māori ora, manawatia te Māori aio, taumai, ko te Māori, haumie, huie, tai kie. Kia ora koutou. Just acknowledge our Indigenous people, our tangata whenua, our Māori people here in Aotearoa. Kia ora.
Thank you, Guy. That's beautiful. Now, can I ask if you would like to do it, please pop in the chat which lands you're coming from. We'd love to see, we can't see you, but we would love to know where you're all coming from. So please feel free to pop up in the chat where you're coming from. Before we get into what I hope is going to be a great discussion, a handful of pieces of housekeeping that I just want to cover off on. If you're having any tech issues at all, there are a couple of wonderful global women with us today, and you can privately message them, Megan Alatini and Chantel Lincoln. You can send them notes in the chat. They are behind the scenes. You can't see them, but they're working to make sure everything works as it should. In addition to, I can see all those beautiful places coming up. Thank you for doing that. In addition to putting up where you're coming from, can you also pop any questions or any comments you have into the chat? You don't have to wait till the end. Just pop it in there, and so I'll keep my eye on that. We'll keep watching so we can get into a really interactive discussion. So I'm going to start by letting us hear from our panel. We're going to get them to give us a bit of an outline of their thoughts on leadership, and then we're going to get into Q&A. Now, let me give you a very brief introduction of all of them. We have a wonderful panel today, the first of whom is the incredible Anna Bligh. She's a very well-respected Aussie leader, and as many of you will know, she was the former Premier of Queensland. She led Queensland when it faced some of the worst flooding in its history. So she's very well known here for the love and care she brought to that terrible time. So she's known in Australia as a leader, not just in political, not-for-profit and not-for-profit space, but also business. And at the moment, she's leading the peak body for the Aussie banks, the ABA, which is not an easy gig through this period of critical reform. And at the same time as she's working to strengthen bank culture and rebuild trust, we had a Banking Royal Commission over here. It was very tough for the banks. Anna has also driven the banking industry's response to COVID. Second panelist we've got is Guy Ryan. You Kiwis, if you don't know him, you really should. He's an award-winning entrepreneur, leader and speaker. By background, he's an Edmund Hillary Fellow. He was Young New Zealander of the Year in 2015, which is when I think we first met Guy, and he's represented New Zealand, many international summits and many discussions on leadership. He founded Inspiring Stories, which is one of the events that I try really hard not to miss. It's an incredible not-for-profit with this very bold vision about backing young people to change the world. And because of that work, he's really at the heart of Kiwi entrepreneurial young leadership. Our final panelist today is the amazing Ilana Atlas. Ilana is one of the most senior non-executive directors in Australia. She's on the board of the ANZ Bank, Origin Energy, and a property group, a Centre Group, all big listed companies. She's known in the not-for-profit space as well. She's the chair of a really impressive organisation called Jarwin, which works to connect First Nations people with the business community. And she also sits on the board of Australia's largest philanthropic organisation, the Paul Ramsay Foundation. I should also note the wonder of being with Global Women today, that Ilana and Anna are members of Chief Executive Women, and I am too, and that's the Aussie equivalent of Global Women. So it's wonderful that we're all connecting like this. So thanks to the three of you for being here with us today, and thanks to everybody who's joining in this discussion. So onto the topic, and to start throwing to the panel, the topic is a session I think everybody is passionate about at the moment, around leadership, and leadership in times of crisis, and global leadership in times of crisis. And boy, is it ever the time for us to be talking about this. You know, we all know we've got these existential crises happening, you know, these two massive crises that are intersecting each other, you know, the first being climate change, the second being the health and economic crisis that COVID is bringing us. They're feeding and revealing the inequality in our world. And I believe that both of these crises, they require us to think beyond family, beyond community, beyond country, and even beyond nation states. They ask of us that we unite to think globally. And at the same time as we're dealing with that, all these other pressures are happening to leaders, whether they be changing expectations from all our stakeholders around ESG, ethical social governance, whether they are changing needs of our employees in the way that we work because of COVID, changing the competitive landscape, and all the risks and opportunities that come from that. So we really are, we're living in an Overton window, a time where we can make massive and radical change. Very interesting time if you have the privilege to lead. So I want to just throw to our panelists and open the floor for some opening comments on the topic of leadership, asking about what each of you have observed during your journey, including the last couple of years, and thoughts about leadership in crisis. So Anna, how about I throw to you first on that topic?
Sure, thank you, Audette. It's great to be here. Look, it's a very big question, and I know you want to start with some short answers, so I'm not going to cover the entire field. But I think for me, every time I've experienced a crisis, the situation and the circumstances are always vastly different on the one hand, but on the other, it always confirms for me and reminds me again that of just how important leadership is during a crisis. It's that is the time when people most look to their leaders. They do it instinctively. You know, people who might otherwise not take much notice of what the boss says, or people who've got little or no interest in politics, suddenly, you know, they're reading everything that comes out of the CEO's office, or they're watching their Prime Minister or their Premier every single press conference. And so that task of leadership to inspire people and to give them the tools they need to keep themselves safe and to continually communicate with them, you know, is the same whatever the crisis is, that people will look to you. It'll be one of the, as soon as they realise there's some unknown danger, they will look immediately to, you know, who can help me understand what I have to do to look after myself and my family. I think for me, as a reflection of the last couple of years and this crisis particularly, when I reflect on it, most of the crises I've been through in my life, and I've been through some very, as you said, big natural disasters, political crises, you know, an oil tanker but grounding itself on the Great Barrier Reef, you know, all kinds of things. But they've always been quite time limited, even if natural disasters go over sort of 4 or 5 weeks. And one of the things I've often said to people about leading in crises is, you know, don't underestimate, you know, adrenaline is made for a purpose and it works and it will get you through it. But the difference this time was, one, just how incredibly protracted the event has been. This is not a 4-week event. This has been 2 years of our lives, you know, a time, you know, just so long. So the things that would normally, I think, really matter, you know, in my experience, you know, energy, optimism, stamina, resilience, I've had to personally really dig deep to make sure that I kept those things, you know, at the top, you know, as far as I could at the top of, you know, myself. And I think the other is just that this was a ubiquitous crisis. Every other crisis I've been through, you know, so when Queensland was suffering the worst natural disasters, we could call on neighbours in New South Wales and Western Australia and Victoria and even New Zealand and say, we need help. And people would come. And even at a very personal level, you know, if you have sick children, you can call on your mum to come and help. In this crisis, we couldn't do any of that. And we watched across the world and saw that nobody else could either. And so I think they were two really different features of the past 2 years that I think have required leaders to draw on probably some of the same attributes and characteristics, but draw on them much more deeply and probably, well, my experience, I found I really had to learn more about where my reserves were. Had to go and find the extra fuel tank that, I hadn't opened for 30 years.
Yeah, that is really interesting, actually. You're right, Anna, that, we find ourselves in a situation where others can't help us because they're in crisis too. And it's going on and on and on, and how different that is. Guy, I'll throw to you to give us some thoughts, to pick up on some of that and give us some of your opening thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Audette. Look, I just can resonate with that hugely, Anna, that idea of getting deep. And I think that's true for all of us, regardless of whether you're in a leadership position or not. This enduring challenge of a global pandemic that we're facing, the impacts are so vast and varied for all of us. I think for me personally, I'm a dad. I got a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. And so, that's a whole nother layer of complexities at home without kind of immediate family around. And then I run a charity. So, and a lot of the mahi, the work that we do through Inspiring Stories with our vision around backing young people to change the world is face-to-face events, gathering, mentoring. And so quick pivots to digital in some cases just haven't been possible. And the impact of COVID on events, especially, tourism, so many industries has been significant and turned our industry upside down. So it's been a real roller coaster over the last couple of years. But I was also reflecting over, for me and for us in leading this work, it's been a 10-year journey. And what are some of the great examples of leadership that I've seen young people, particularly at the forefront of over that time, at least here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and kind of dating back to around 2011, where we had big earthquakes in Christchurch, and young people responded to that with the Student Volunteer Army and mobilising tens of thousands of students to help with clean-up efforts. And it was just a remarkable example of the potential and power for young people to contribute and lead in response to crisis. More recently, a couple of examples, again pre-COVID, but we've had the school strikes for climate, which obviously had ripple effect beyond New Zealand, but here in little old Aotearoa, we had, I think, about 170,000 people turn out in the streets in March in support of bolder action and bolder leadership on climate change in 2019. And young people were really at the forefront of that, which certainly helped to elevate the issue. Generation Zero, a youth-led climate-focused movement here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, drafted the Zero Carbon Act, which went to government, which now we've got, passed, and that Zero Carbon Act is now in place. So I think, in response to both like immediate and longer term disasters and challenges, there's been some amazing examples of young people stepping up. Even right now, COP26, we've got some young New Zealanders who have had the opportunity to present to a global audience around the realities of climate change and the need for bold action and leadership. So again, great to see young people leading in that space.
Yeah, that's wonderful, isn't it? People are magnificent. That's a question I want to come to later, is whether or not, we see magnificence rise in crises. But let me throw to Ilana to give us your thoughts from the perspectives that you sit at in terms of leadership at the top of some of the biggest companies in Australia. I would love your opening observations and thoughts about that.
Thanks, Audette, and thank you for the opportunity of being part of this extraordinary panel of people. So, well, look, I just to try and add rather than repeat all the excellent insights we've heard so far. As Anna quite rightly said, there's no rule book when you're dealing with crises, and that's certainly been the case over the last couple of years. And so I think good leaders rely on their internal resources, because ultimately there are no guidebooks to follow. And those resources, are courage, resilience, and experience too, I think is incredibly important. And those resources help you act. And I think that is the marker of a leader here, action rather than talk. And certainly, I think people are looking to leaders to be calm and considered. I think there are huge levels of anxiety And so it's very important, as Anna quite rightly said, everyone does look to the leader in these situations. And I think their calmness and poise and considered approach to dealing with trauma is incredibly important. I suppose to extend some of the comments that have been made, I mean, this crisis has led everyone to be very insular. We've essentially been sitting at home, looking at four walls. And so I think it has been a very individual response to the crisis. And great leaders really help us look much further than those four walls and take us externally. And I think that's very important for survival, and survival in a healthy way. And that goes to, I think, your introductory comments, which leaders show us that it's important to look beyond our four walls, our family, even our immediate community, to see what's happening globally. And I think that's where great leadership has shone through this crisis. I think some of the issues around, for example, global vaccination rates, when you're sitting here in a very, very affluent, wealthy country, are really important issues that I think great leaders are making us focus on in a situation where we are extremely insular.
Yeah, that's so right. And I want to come to some and ask you all for some examples of what you've seen as great leadership. And I'm very interested in your point, Ilana, about experience. And I want to come to Guy to ask him about that, because we need both, right? We need experienced leadership at the same time as we need young leadership, which is what we're seeing in COP26. And how do we get that balance right? Anna, I wanted to ask you some questions, and please put some questions for us in the chat or the Q&A. That would be really great. But let me just follow up on a couple of these themes. And I'm interested when we talk about the landscape and all the learnings. You are an experienced leader, and you're famous for your calmness during particularly the Queensland floods. Like, how is all that? How have you taken those early learnings into the work that you're doing now, into leading, the banking community through the crisis, and all the tens of thousands of staff that, that the ABA as a peak body for the banks have to look after, as well as customers? How that comment that you made about not having a rule book to follow, but what did that look like for you in reality? Was there some rule book from what you'd already learned, or how's that unfolded for you?
I might just explain the rule book comment, because just for the audience, Audette gave us some, ideas of the sorts of things she might ask us, and she referred to this quote that I have used many times when I'm speaking about this issue. The quote is, "Leadership is what you see when the rule book runs out." And I heard this quote because I was invited not long after the big natural disasters to go and speak at a year 12 graduation, and that was the topic that they gave me. And it resonated with me so strongly, because I had just been through this incredibly prolonged crisis where people had lost lives, they'd lost homes, they'd lost farms, and it had been across the entire state. It wasn't just one town. It was, and just at the end of all of the floods, we got a cyclone. So, it was a very catastrophic and very traumatic event. And that saying really resonated with me, because to me, it felt very early in the event. I'd been involved in natural disasters before. Queensland is a subtropical state. It's not unusual to have big storms or floods, but something of this scale we had never, dealt with, and nor had Australia's emergency services. So we had to think very differently. And, I could almost feel the rule book run out. One of the things I say is, if there's a clear rule book, we can all follow it. That's really probably almost a definition of a crisis, is a traumatic event for which there is, no clear map of what to do next. And I remembered, actually, when I was the mother of a brand new baby for the first time, coming home from hospital, one of the things I actually said to myself, that where's the recipes? Where's the recipe? Because I couldn't make it work, just like every other, first time mum. And it felt a bit like that. So one of the things that I think I learned through it, and which I have relied on in subsequent events, is that when that rule book runs out. So we had a rule book about what to do when something floods. We didn't have a rule book for what to do when everything floods, and you've run out of people, and you've run out of tractors, and you've run out of helicopters, and and it's something that's very hard to define. The closest I can come to is intuition, that life lays down layers in you, that we all go through crises in our personal lives. We've all had, terrible things happen to friends or to family. We've had confronted illness or accidents ourselves. And every time we go through that, something gets kind of laid down that we then rely on the next time, maybe not consciously, but, I think one of the things that people often say about the, leaders in crisis is that the importance of being decisive and being the one who has to make the call. And you're often making a call in very high stakes situations with suboptimal conditions. You don't have the time or the people or the necessary, ability to get the expertise. And I think one of the things that's really important is that good leaders make the call, and they make it really clear to everybody that they will take responsibility for the call. Because generally you've got a choice between two really bad options, and you're trying to pick the least bad. And I think when you're in those very scary situations, your team and your best people and your experts, they need to know that if the call goes wrong, you're not going to turn around with a finger and point it at them, because you need those people to have complete confidence that they can criticize the call, that they can, call out a different option. So I think that taking responsibility for the call is really important, and conveying that in a very explicit and implicit way is important. And the confidence to do that, for me, comes from, something quite visceral. It's, I don't want to trivialize it, but it's almost like something like, what does your tummy tell you? There's something, okay, two big calls, both have got bad consequences. I've been here before, use all my rational brain on the facts I've got. And when that kind of runs out, you've just got to make the call on the best gut instinct, intuition that you've got. And then you've got to go with it and accept that there's possibly some consequences, and hope that they're not as bad as the consequences of the other call.
That's a hugely courageous act, isn't it? Just to sort of pick up on that for a second, the courage to make a decision, and then the courage to take responsibility for it. I think that's really a key piece, and I wonder sometimes if that's in everybody or if that's in only some. And when you look at the leadership we've seen, good and bad, through this current last 2 years of crisis, interesting to kind of run that razor over it. And also that question of instinct. And Guy, I want to throw to you on this, because and to pick up on Ilana's piece about experience, and Anna, you said, layers are laid down. That's true. That's what happens to us, right? But it's really interesting, because we're seeing this amazing leadership from young people who are incredibly instinctive and not prejudiced or by years of blah, 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 and sort of set in kind of siloed ways of thinking. So, what have you observed about leadership during crisis in terms of young entrepreneurial leadership? And how do you think about that from what you've seen with the leaders that you've worked with in relation to this issue about instinct, about years of experience, about different ways of having to lead?
It's a big question, Audette. I think there's just a huge spectrum, of both lived experience, circumstance, examples there. I think, I'm very mindful that the impact of COVID on young people, on education, on employment, on mental health, has been not a positive one, and we don't even know the long tail effects of that yet. And I've also seen examples where, young people are stepping up, young people are either pivoting their projects or their ventures or their business models, and kind of discovering new silver linings and ways to perhaps organise or work remotely, to either build ventures or lead projects in ways that again, there's not been a rule book for, but they've had that conviction, you know, they've had that, that North Star of where they want to go, and they've just figured out how to do it. I think, you know, even for me in our tiny little team, where we've got a team distributed across the country, you know, working remotely, just seeing the variances and the difference between the impacts of mental health and how COVID is impacting each of us differently. And, you know, perhaps traditionally when we might come together in person to solve challenges, you know, and build rapport, we're just not able to do that anymore. So that actually means new rituals, new rhythms, you know, trying to create new ways of working together online, creating safe spaces for people in the team to bring their full selves to work, you know, almost unprecedented levels of flexibility and trust, you know, to back the people around you, to give them space to do what they need to do, whilst trying to navigate through this huge uncertainty and complexity. It's hard, and I come back to that dig deep piece and not having a rule book. And I think, you know, like, young people have got the biggest stake in the future, but within that spectrum of young people and different circumstances and lived experience, there's definitely young people there who don't have access to devices or data, you know, or reception, and even quick shifts to digital and online are just not accessible for big chunks of the population. But, you know, including pockets here in New Zealand, but around the world. So there's a whole convergence of challenges. And I think for our leaders at the top, who are kind of, you know, trying to make decisions on these big challenges head on, it's really important to be reminded of the reality of the hardship that people, you know, perhaps in our more vulnerable communities, the hardship that they're facing on a daily basis, and understanding the potential impact of the decisions that they're making, you know, procurement, legislation, investment, you know, build back better, whatever it is, there'll be ways to do that so that more people can benefit.
Yeah, I think that you're making a really important point, of course, and we can't typecast any of this or generalize too much, that people's experiences are so different across the spectrum. And I wonder why we're not listening more to the leadership lessons and learnings of traditional peoples, you know, whether that's Maori Pacifica, whether that's First Nations people, whether it's people of deep culture around the world who actually have had those layers of experience and that gut feeling and understanding and intuition of being through so much of this. That's another piece, I think, of the puzzle that maybe we're not bringing in. Ilana, I want to ask you about this from a board perspective. So what have you seen in the boardrooms of Australia around leadership and crisis? I'm particularly interested in what you've seen in terms of the way boards are thinking, not only around COVID, but climate change, for instance, you know, examples of where you've seen leadership or where you've seen not, kind of pulling those threads of courage and resilience and experience or agility, different life experiences happening. Tell us how that's played out in the boardrooms of Australia.
Before I do, can I just comment on some of the comments that have been made already, which is, it's a fascinating conversation. And just on Anna's remarks, where I completely agree about courage. And it's interesting to me, Anna talks about gut instinct and whatever, and it's, I think generally we call that good judgment. And judgment isn't really the province of experience, although experience is an element in it. I think judgment is something that generally people acquire sometimes through time, but perhaps just instinctively they have good judgment. So it's an interesting discussion, and also the need for empathy, as Guy quite rightly said, the need to absolutely understand the challenges that everybody is facing in the group of people that you're leading. So it's been a great discussion. Thank you. Oh, and I suppose one other comment I'd make is this is global women, and it's quite interesting to me if I reflect on my own experience and the courage that one needs to make these difficult decisions. I think as a younger woman, I probably wouldn't have had that courage, and I think women perhaps have challenges with confidence that perhaps evolve through time, and that's an interesting thing for young women to think about. You know, they probably have the capacity and have the judgment, but do they have the confidence to exercise it? And I think that's something we need to be conscious of. Just very quickly on boards, it's been an incredibly interesting time to be chairing a board of a public company through this. And I would say that there are two roles that boards have undertaken, good boards have undertaken, and I'd make some observations about them. The first would be that boards have been overseers, and I use that word in a good way. I don't know, I probably should use another one, but it has negative connotations. But I think boards have had to be good overseers during this period because management has needed to really be completely rigorous in their prioritisation of what's important. It has been all about, focusing on employees, their health, welfare, safety. It's also been very much focused on cash flow in organisations. Are we getting enough cash in to pay our bills? It's been a matter of survival, and also focusing on your customers and their welfare and their well-being. And it's been a matter for boards to be very clear with management that that's actually what they had to focus on and not other peripheral things. The other role boards have had to play is through this period, they have had the opportunity to think about consequences. So what does all this mean? What's going to change? How is the world going to change as a result of what we've been through? What will be different? What are the risks? And probably more importantly, what are the opportunities that come out of this profound change in the way we work, in the needs of customers? Technology has changed everything. So I think boards, while management really has been focused on the crisis, and as others have said, it's gone on for a long time and taken huge amounts of stamina to keep focused on the most important things. I think boards have also been guiding organisations to think about the future. And that brings me to, okay, what does that mean? And I think boards have now focused much more on purpose in organisations. I mean, why are we here? After we've spent so long staring at four walls, I think people are understanding that actually we really need to focus on why are we here? What are we doing here? What is the good that we're creating for our communities, for our society? And I think boards are much more focused on that. And the particular example of it is climate change. And I think we've seen a profound change in organisations and their focus on 1.5 degrees and what their role very specifically is in getting us to that ambition. So it's not just, we'll commit to zero emissions by 2050. Boards are now very focused with organisations on tangible action plans to get us to our objectives within much, much shorter timeframes. And I think in part the crisis has led us to that focus. Let me stop there.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I'd be fascinated to know what's going on in New Zealand around these issues. But over here in Australia, really, the private sector are leading in so much of this way. We've had a question
Audette,
from.
Sorry,
Oh, Anna.
I'm just going to cut right across you there.
Pick up, do it.
Because I'd just be interested in Ilana's observation on something that I was reflecting on as you were talking. Something of this scale of the pandemic has required quite publicly governments around the world to act, vastly differently than they have before. But one of the things that I think has been very interesting and hasn't had a lot of attention is it's also required the corporate world to behave differently. And so in banking, which is obviously something that, I was present at the table, but I'm sure it was happening at lots of other tables, it required competitors to act anti-competitively. It required competitors to act cooperatively in the public interest. And so, in an industry association, you've always got a group of competitors around the table and you're always trying to manage that. But so a concrete example, right at the beginning, the instinct of, all of the individual banks was to have their own package of support for their own customers. And, almost to kind of compete with each other about who might have the biggest and best package. And that's it's a good urge. You don't want, it's in customers' interests that banks compete. So you don't want to get rid of that competitive urge. But at a time like this, everybody around the table understood that they had to overcome that urge, and that the worst thing that would that it would be so much harder in very confusing circumstances where people were being bombarded by complex health information if we were to try and go out and talk about 22 different packages of support. And so people did overcome that. But, you know, you had our major supermarkets sitting down and talking about cooperating to make sure that, you know, there was adequate supplies of food, even if it meant one supermarket chain sort of stepping back to let the other one do something more. And so I think, to me, and I'm just interested because Ilana would have been on those boards at the time they were going through that, you know, that it seemed to me that while it wasn't their first instinct, because they're competitors, they actually flipped really quickly. That acceptance that actually we've got to behave in a way that, frankly, might in other circumstances be illegal. You know, there was so much cooperation going on, and I don't think there's been much exploration really of kind of how that happened.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it, as you say, it happened very quickly. I think we understood pretty quickly that there was so much on our plate to manage the challenges. The more we could leverage support and assistance externally, understanding the legal, obviously, implications, the better we would be. And I think what also was interesting was that the history, you know, through the Royal Commission and the focus on trust and maintaining trust actually encouraged that as well. Mm-hmm. And I think you would have seen that I think sort of financial institutions in Australia are very focused on remediating what is perceived to be a trust deficit. And I think this was a great opportunity to do that. And I think the view would be that the way that financial institutions managed and assisted customers through this has been positive. What is interesting, though, is how long it lasts. Yes. And there are, I think it evidences that there are significant things that can be done together which actually don't relate to competition. There's a lot we can do together actually that can assist the sector, but aren't necessarily competitive. And I would think, and you'd be better placed than I am because you understand what's going on more broadly, but I think people are actually starting to think that way.
And actually, can I pull that thread for a second, Ilana? I want to lift it to one piece higher, which is how do we take that spirit of collaboration and cooperation? And Guy, you talked about the volunteer army and, you know, that there's something bigger than our own companies. How do we take that and make it, bring it to the concept there's something bigger than a nation state? And so, you know, how we deal with. So can I throw to you, Guy, if I can, I just want Guy's thoughts on that in terms of what he's seeing. Are people able to lift above their own corporate, social entrepreneur, not-for-profit, community, whatever it is, and lift up? Have you seen that? And how do we lead that?
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? I think there's two major narratives playing out around the world at the moment. There's the story of crisis, which is COVID, it's climate, it's all the hard stuff. And that, you know, inevitably that feels really hard. Lived experience is hard. It can leave us scared, disempowered, disengaged. And then there's kind of the story of hope, of opportunity, of what is the future that we want to create. And I think coming back to the question around, you know, collaboration and taking the climate crisis, you know, because that's the big, slow moving tidal wave that's just going to exacerbate everything else. I think there is so much demand that I see from young people around me, at least, for bold action there. You know, to make some real commitments, to put some really firm stakes in the ground around COP26, and that as a kind of a huge global challenge that demands, you know, unprecedented investment from the financial sector. It demands, you know, the right layers of legislation and commitments from government. It demands a whole new level of leadership and commitment from businesses and the grassroots community adaptation stuff. I feel like that's kind of the such a compelling example of a really complex global problem that we've been talking about for 30, 40 years now. But now it's at it's the 11th hour. You know, the demand for action is so urgent, even though it's been swamped by COVID a bit. And even though we haven't resolved that yet, I do think we've seen some amazing examples of collaboration in that space across all those different verticals, across different countries. The question for me in that is, how do we level that up and actually how do we get there faster?
Yeah, really good question. Now, I'm getting some great questions from the floor, and I want to send this one first, or ask Anna about this one first, which is, can you give us an example of what the most impactful thing you've done as a leader to support people is? And then as an example of what's been really helpful or impactful for you to receive from a leader. So let me throw that one to you.
Okay. Look, I'll take this question. It's sort of cast broadly, but I might take it in the context of the fact that we've been talking about leadership in crisis. I think there's probably two things that I would say in terms of on reflection, what I think made a big impact. And again, I'll go back to those big natural disasters. Firstly, I think, there's another saying, you can't over communicate in a crisis. You possibly can, but it's a saying because it just how important information is, and how, I think for human beings, we feel empowered when we feel we've got some facts and the information that we need. So, and sometimes, well, in a big crisis and disaster, often the information that the leader is giving is the worst possible news. And for me, I think what I found was it seemed to give people, the worse the news was, and the more honest and blunt and frank I was about it, it seemed to give people more confidence than if I had tried to soften it. Because they thought, oh, if she's saying that, then it must be really bad. I better take it seriously. And I think they felt if I was saying it that bluntly, that I was being honest, that there wasn't, kind of political gilding of the lily. And so, yes, if I said, you have to be out by 2 or the bridge is closing, and we will not be able to get rescue boats in, and you're putting your life at risk, that kind of very blunt messaging. So I think honesty and information was really, I know people felt that empowered them. And I think the second thing that's really important, particularly in those immediate kind of very frightening circumstances, is empathy. And it's actually something that that I have found for myself, I've had to remind myself about, not because I don't think I'm an empathetic person, but when you're, in the middle of it and you're running it, you've got 1,000 facts in your head. And those decisions that I talked about before, you've been giving water levels and temperatures and, all kinds of, police zones. And in the middle of all of that, you need to, I have a little voice in my head that says, remember, at the middle of it all, there's just people. And there was a moment that Australians, or some Australians on the line, will recall, where I think the crisis had been rolling for 3 weeks, and then the capital city flooded, and I was delivering a message very clearly designed to try and inspire and lift people and rally them for what they had to do and clean up. And in the middle of it, my voice choked, and I started, to get that terrible, your nose starts to cry, that you're fighting back tears. And that was not something that I planned at all. But it is the thing that has made the most impact on people. People still talk to me about where they were, how it made them feel. I still have men come up to me and say, I've only cried twice in my life, the day I married my wife and you on television, So there was a lot of impact, but I think when I look back and try to pack that, I think it was almost that I was giving people, as I said, I didn't plan it, but they saw me have a moment of real grief, and it almost gave them permission to say, before we get out with our mops and our buckets and get on to the next bit, we've lost a lot, and it's okay to just stop and feel the emotion of that. And that actually having that emotion, it's almost like you can't go and get the mop and the bucket till you've had a little cry and you've got it out, and you acknowledge that this is trauma, this is grief. And there are different, obviously there's different scales of grief, but, there's not many big crises where people don't go through something highly emotional and sort of remembering that, if you like. I would say, however, if I'd only had that impact because it was an unusual event for for me. If I had cried at every other press conference, someone would have taken me out.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Trying to square that circle, right?
Yeah.
Because you're talking about directional leadership, you're talking about courage, you're talking about calm, and at the same time, you're saying at certain points you've got to empathize, and maybe that brings you back to the instinct piece.
Yeah. I think emotion is really important, but it's got to have its place. And what people want at various stages is, confidence, clarity, authority. They want you to be more authoritative than they would normally want, I think, and more kind of chain of command in a crisis. But you do need to be able to flip to the other side of that at the right moment. In terms of what's impacted on me, I think I would say, and I go back to, early 2020 when all of this was unfolding for all of us. And it's the same as what I said earlier. And for me, it was, the lengthy, explicit information and honesty from government and the chief health officers, because it was such a big unknown. And I've got an elderly mum that I was worried about. Suddenly we had all of our older people were at serious risk, and so everyone feels those things. And it's one of the things that's reminded me again of how powerful information and honesty is from people who are in authority in those moments, because your instinct is to act to protect yourself and the people you love.
Yes.
And you need something to help you do that.
You need communication, you need courage. Now I'm going to take the conversation in a different direction. We've got some great questions coming through, and I'm conscious that we're into our last 10 minutes. So Ilana, I want to throw this one to you. And this is a question about systems change, I think, and the sort of systemic nature of transformation that we require, to talk to climate change. And the question is, how do you see leaders trying to figure out where to invest their time and the energy? Like, I guess it's that where do you begin question, when you're in you have the privilege of leadership and you have this massive systemic issues to deal with. How do you think that through, and what do you see from great leaders in that regard?
Well, I think you always have to start with purpose. And so, every organization, every person, we're here for a reason. And so I think you need to fundamentally understand that. And that then guides you as to how you prioritize where you invest your effort. One of the challenges I have with the concept of ESG, for example, is that it's just such a broad bucket of things, environmental, social, and governance. It's just such a broad group of various issues. And so, for example, in organizations I'm associated with, obviously, we talk about ESG, but fundamentally, we need to understand what is it that we can make a difference. Where can we make a difference? When you consider our business, our organisation, our people, our capability, our purpose, where should the focus be? And I think that then guides you to where you want to invest your time and effort. And so there are some organisations. So, for example, when I was chairing Coca-Cola Amatil, we absolutely focused our effort on health and well-being, because our consumers were saying to us they weren't really interested in drinking our sugary soft drinks. So really we understood that actually our customers, our communities were telling us that was where we needed to focus our efforts. We also needed to focus our efforts on waste, because the community had absolutely no way, would not truck our contribution to waste. And so these things do guide you as to how you prioritise your effort and where you can make a difference and a change.
Yes, isn't that wonderful? When I think about purpose on the boards that I've been involved with, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, that was the discussion that directors had. What's our purpose and what are we doing with ESG? The last thing in a board meeting is they were trying to run out to get the early plane. And I have to say, I still have my moments on these boards where I want to bend double with laughter when I watch the dinosaurs the first thing they want to talk about now is what's our purpose. So there's got to be some wins in that. In fact, I'm going to take that thread, and I'm going to throw to you, Guy, another great question that we've had from the floor, which is about purpose-led leadership. And the question is, or the observation is, we've hung on to this sort of traditional view of leadership for too long, and whether or not what we're experiencing as a world now in the course of the last 18 months gives us permission to embrace a different kind of leadership based on trust and openness and empathy, which actually comes back to both of your points, like figuring out what the purpose is and leading everybody there. Have we been able to embrace a new kind of style of leadership? And if we have, are we going to be able to keep that going forward? Because clearly we need it if we're going to face the challenges that we're dealing with head on.
Yeah, I mean, clearly we need it, right? And I just think, slightly longer time horizon there, where we've come from very traditional top-down command control structures. We've come from a time where, primary purpose of business has been to make as much money as possible without too little consideration on impact or wider society or environment. And now we find ourselves in the situation that we're in, and that's no longer possible. And then at the same time, the kind of a silver lining, or the story of hope and possibility there is, there are so many amazing examples of things being done differently. We're seeing massive shifts in investment landscape, putting into things that are better for wider society and planet. We're seeing a whole range of new impact and purpose-driven businesses that put purpose and that why right at the core of what they stand for, and existing as a business or a company actually to make a difference, for society, for the environment, and really living that and leading that authentically and embedding it into the leadership, into the values, into the culture of organisation. There's some amazing examples of that. And I think, the other piece there around, like, as consumers, we're caring more and more about the impact of our purchasing decisions and voting with our dollars. So in terms of I guess new models of leadership, like the younger generation growing up now is growing up in such a different time, than what it was 30, 40, 50, even 20 years ago, right? It's just such a different time. And we have tools, technology, mechanisms that should enable people anywhere to contribute their ideas for better ways of doing things. And, even here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we've got politicians and leaders of government, at times sitting in kind of ivory towers centred in the capital city, making decisions around policy legislation that affect people in very different corners of the country with very different lived experiences. We have mechanisms to actually provide direct feedback so that those leaders can have live lived experience examples of what's not working and ways that it could actually be done better, more effectively. I think we have the tools, we have the tech, and the challenge to actually incorporate and honour that stuff and actually create new models for decision making, for where we deploy resource to solve these challenges. Hopefully we're on a shift there, and that shift's playing out.
I hope we're on a shift. Now we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to ask you one question, the same question to each of you before we end up. If I haven't had a chance to get to your questions, I apologise to the audience, but we've had lots of great commentary here. But my question to each of you is, just to make it real, is give us an example of one great leader that you want to highlight, and what it is about that leader, in whatever space you want to highlight that you admire, so we can pull these threads together. I'm going to start with you, Anna.
Well, Audette didn't give us any notice of this one. There's so many great leaders I could draw from. But look, I think the one I will call on is Nelson Mandela. And one of the reasons why I think I admire him so much is I think there are many attributes of great leaders, but one of them is very much about personal characteristics. And I think it is, Ilana talked earlier about that, just that ability to be calm when all about you are losing your head, and which means you can't be a volatile personality who is dragged one way or the other by, very fierce emotions. And if there was anybody who was entitled to, live his life with a raging anger that consumed him, it was Nelson Mandela, who spent, more than 3 decades of the best years of his life in a tiny prison cell. And rather than come out of that prison cell consumed by a raging anger that made him want to throw bombs, he had this ability personally to overcome that emotion and use all of his energy in the interests of his people. And, you know, for me, I always feel, because there are times when you get very angry, when people betray you, when people do crazy, stupid things, where you want to get angry. And you can get so distracted by those kinds of emotions. And I see it happen in politics all the time. People spend too much time settling old political scores instead of getting on and doing what it is that the community elected them to do. And that involves being able to overcome emotion. And, you know, I've never been jailed for more than 3 decades, but I think if he could do that, then we should all be able to overcome those emotions that can take us sideways, and keep focused on the task.
Yeah, excellent example for Kiwis, particularly for all of us, but because as you know, New Zealand really divided when the Springboks came to New Zealand in the early 80s. A defining moment really in our history of standing up, standing against race discrimination and discrimination in all forms. Ilana, let me throw to you. Great leader that you admire.
I'll be very quick. So whenever I'm asked this question, I always say exactly the same as Anna, Nelson Mandela. However, the person I am going to nominate is you, Audette. And the reason why is because you've taught me courage. And I think for outstanding leadership, that's what you need. And I won't say much more than that, but to have watched you stand up resolutely for what you believe and stand in so many worlds, but remain true to that has really been an inspiration to me. So,
oh, Ilana, that's so lovely. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
I know I haven't got much time to wax lyrical, so I'll leave it at that.
Stop right there.
Thanks,
Guy, let me throw to you. You bring it home for us.
It's so funny, Ilana, that you were also thinking of Nelson Mandela and then you shifted tack. So from the start, I actually thought I'd get a little bit personal on it, and I thought I'd say Audette as well. For what Audette has built with Adara Group, you know, for me as a young aspiring social entrepreneur, has just been such a compelling, inspirational example of kind of what's possible with doing things differently. And not just that, but you know, for me as a young little punk from New Zealand, when I reached out to Audette, you know, Audette came out to New Zealand to speak at our big festival for the Future Summit, paid her own way, gave her own time, was there for the whole weekend, rolled up sleeves, was involved in a whole bunch of different things, and then was so moved by the experience as part of the Impact Awards that we'd created for the first time that she was like, you need a Global Impact Award. I'll pay for it. Here, let's do it, you know. So somebody that just on so many ways just, you know, is driven by such a strong sense of purpose, you know, absolutely lives your values, walks in so many different worlds, and is just so servant-hearted. So, Audette, thank you.
All right, now you three have completely embarrassed me. So, and if anybody who's watching this is wondering if this is my payment for being the moderator today, I could say there's $100 in the mail coming to each of the panelists for that glowing ending. Okay, I think it's time for us to wrap up. This has been a wonderful session. Thank you so much to the three of you for this really important discussion. We could talk and talk about these issues. Can I just say out there to everybody who's watching, if you have the privilege to lead, whether it's in your family or your community or your company or your country or in the world, please step forward right now. We are living through what is going to be the most important decade, I think, that any of us are living through. And we need great leadership. We need new leadership. We need agile leadership. And we need courageous leadership. So you've had a bit of an example of that with our panelists today. And I thank you all very much for being part of this and for listening. I'm saluting all my Kiwi cousins over there and wishing you all very safe and very happy end of the week. Thank you.
Thank you.